as the quintessential, picturesque image of a man-made American lake, is vast, clear but rarely cold, and full of fish, like other great man-made lakes, such as Norman Harrington or Thunder Arrow, which have had a colorful cultural past. Myths range from man-eating puppies, to tooth-covered bottoms that can leap over boats, to squids that grow to enormous sizes due to radiation leaking from a nearby plant. Bigfoot and the occasional flying saucer were torn up, but none of that ever stuck in my mind, being the typical conservative sportsman who loved to fish on the lake. When I heard old Mrs. Cutler telling people how her dog had been snatched off the beach by a giant man-eating puppy with a belly covered in teeth, I made it my job, moreover, to belittle and ridicule my cousin's co-workers who had a story. Someone showed up who ate or choked on something. In other words, I was kind of stupid to defend myself. I never saw anything that my version of the world was wrong. I lived on a lake. I went fishing with my grandfather all my life. From when he was a kid until his boat broke down and I was sure I wasn't afraid of being wrong. There's something about this lake, which is why I'm writing this partly to see if anyone else has been there. What I saw was partly to warn people to stay apart and also partly as a form of therapy to help me come to terms with what I had been through. We first needed some context to come to terms with it, and I think it all started after high school. As you can see, growing up in the lake where there was very little work for them, those of us who had dived from school had no idea what to do next. It was either work in a power plant or work in a lake, so I combined the two and made it my mission to do. More degrees and more training. Then go back to work as a subsea engineer. I was excited about the idea of fixing the dam and the plant's cooling tunnels where the lake water was pumped in and used to keep the reactors safe, and mostly curious to see what was actually beneath the surface of the Arrow. The man I told was my grandfather, but he wasn't enthusiastic or purposeful in telling me in a tone I never knew he could naturally survive outside the lake. Mrs. Cutler's old fishwife's tale of man-eating puppies and catfish drowning children. She folded her arms and began showing me various scars from fish she had met in the lake and elsewhere, but she never mentioned the strange arrangement of deep wounds in one group. I asked him about his arm, how he had gotten it, and his face had turned pale. He told me that unlike the others, these wounds were not from catfish or eels, but from his boating accident, and he had never spoken before about what had happened that day. The lake, he still refuses to say much, and instead of talking about the folklore of the lakes, he tells me about a group of 3 arrowhead divers in the 1980s who went down to the dam to do something and never came back, thinking it was an accidental drowning caused by faulty equipment. But their bodies were never found, and so they too became part of the local lake. Notes my response to the Arrow was to do something childish and oh so horrible, which my grandfather did not take kindly to, so he took my hand and exclaimed that he knew that the boys who had survived had found one of them turning the other over to drink. My grandfather claimed that one night when he was sitting with a man drinking beer and whiskey until his liver was full, the man told him what he remembered. He was talking about dark snakes coming out of the air and cutting them one by one, and dragging them into the unknown. When I laughed at this and said it out loud, I did not expect that my grandfather, a weather-beaten old fisherman and former naval officer, would be so superstitious. his face becoming superstitious and his hoarse voice telling me of the bad. "The waters I saw if I had nothing to fear, you young people, you think you know, the world thinks you have seen them behind your screens, but you have not stayed behind their waters, especially avoiding this plant that Grandpa ordered." Unfortunately, this was one of the last things I did remember when I went out to train. He died anyway. I thought the best way to honor him was to completely ignore his warnings and concerns and work on the lake as soon as he qualified. After completing my training, I went home, worked in a power plant as an engineer, and because I was one of the people qualified for underwater repair work, I became somewhat invaluable. I mean, there were no jobs. It was somewhat convenient. That said, no one wants to work in a power plant that regularly suffers from power outages or structural damage, but I didn't feel like I wasted a significant amount of time training in underwater repair when most of the time was just maintenance. Major repairs throughout the plant, and some sadistic god probably felt frustrated that I wasn't allowed to dive when one of the taller risers approached me and asked if I wanted to help fix the problem. He had a cooldown or two. The tunnels had stopped working properly, and the consensus was that the tunnel was probably damaged and partially collapsed, but the higher-ups wanted to assess the damage first, and then if it was a simple blockage or a relatively simple repair, we would get there. Myself and another guy who was fit to dive, Eddie, the guy who joined me, was a nice guy, always trying to put me at ease, as this was my first fit dive on a small motorized raft, and we made our way to the underwater area. The tunnels there, we got off and swam away from the safe little raft and dived into the water because he was a little bigger than me. As he said before we got into the water, he told me to just stay with him. He said he was very mysterious and add the fact that it was night, and it was a recipe for your mind to play, and that wasn't a mistake either, because I remember that after a few minutes of diving, I felt terrible fear. It's like you're being watched, or when you're home alone and you think you hear someone's irrational fear. I tell myself, it's just my body's reaction to the fact that I can barely see my face in anything, so I swim around trying my best to ignore it. The anxiety building inside me, and I quickly focus on the task at hand, though my mind reverts to hypervigilant monitoring of my surroundings. I remember that the deeper we swam, the warmer and cloudier the water became as we descended, even though it was dark. And in the dark, my torch sometimes caught my attention. The catfish was big enough to make me feel more uncomfortable, but I tried to keep my nerve from the warmth and depth of the food. What fish wouldn't thrive in such conditions? I thought, besides, I'll do it. I'd never seen a catfish that I could honestly say. The guy was either eating me or choking me, which was a relief to me somewhat. And then suddenly all the big and small were scattering around me and Eddie as they shot out of their hiding places. That should have been all the warning we needed, but we were fools to think so. We had annoyed them because they knew we were about to face the truth. We were in the cooling tunnels when things took a different turn. Eddie looked at the torch on the right as I looked around. The tunnel on the left seemed to be working fine, sucking in water and pumping it into the power plant pool where it was supposed to spit out the other side in the short time it took me to inspect the tunnel for a moment. I was shocked when he turned around to find Eddie went into a rage. I turned around, but there was no sign of him in the dark. If it was a joke or he was messing with me, I still expected the wreckage to come out of his angry swim. When he got out of my line, I couldn't stop. I waited. I couldn't do anything until he suddenly jumped out of the dark and scared the life out of me, which would be a welcome horror, but fate. It wasn't nice, and Eddie wasn't either. Reappear or truly reveal yourself. My heart started beating a little faster the moment I saw him go into seclusion. All I could think of were my grandfather's words, "These are bad waters." They were repeating over and over in my head almost as fast as my voice. My heart was pounding in my chest. In those moments of fear, I saw that faint yellow light shining brighter and deeper. It was Eddie, his flame that I could see in the fog below. That finally, or maybe he was playing a joke on me. I threw him the Welder's engraving overwhelmed me, and I swam to meet him, but as I was hitting him hard, my eyes saw more clearly that the light in front of me was his torch, and it was true, but Eddie wasn't holding it. He was simply sinking into the depths of the lake, drifting away and leaving me to the safety of my mate, and I cautiously swam back into the tunnels, and I began to think that perhaps he was cleaning up the debris in the block tunnel, and somehow he was entangled and pulled out by me. At the entrance to the tunnel, my torch flipped over. It was wide enough to fit a truck through, and the gap in it was dark and empty, which was odd because there was no obvious structural damage, no sign of blockage at all. My torch light couldn't penetrate it, and the first fear took hold of me as I watched the silent, motionless shadows fill the opening, the darkness swallowing up my courage and confidence, and I felt more lost than I had ever felt before. I swam in front of this cooler. The tunnel looked into the abyss, hoping that Eddie had made it out of the void unscathed, but it wasn't a void at all, and far from the void, as my torch lit up the colorful night surface, flickering, turbulent, falling. To my utter disbelief, I opened my tire-sized eyes in fear, ran and backed up for a second, and through the fog of panicked bubbles that had blown my glasses, I saw something huge moving slowly down the tunnel with a big thick black back. Claws scattered around a large phosphorescent eye, each end displayed red rings of light that pulsated and moved across the beast's dark hide, their speed increasing as the bright blue eye focused on me through a horizontal slit-shaped pupil, and when it saw me, it saw what it was, too, and though my mind couldn't process the reality, I was certain that trapped in the tunnel was a massive cephalopod, a giant octopus, a kraken of monstrous proportions, a creature intelligent enough to camouflage itself. Like a shadow within the tunnel and escaping the sights of the troubled lake community, it was clear from here and its appearance that the creature was far from ordinary. Beneath the black tendrils running beneath it were jagged teeth and hooks that retracted and extended in and out. These appendages of red flesh slithered out and over the threshold of the tunnel like a snake, the frozen place flashing in my mind with the wounds on my grandfather's arms, creating strange jagged patterns. Could such an appendage have been the cause? And worse, I understood the fish wives' tales about the black-tail leech at the bottom of his teeth. The tentacles are one of many that would have extended and grabbed me as they did with the Arrowhead 3. I knew what was coming and swam for my life and surfaced as hard as I could. I looked back to see if it was chasing me or following me, but there was nothing below or around me, just a complete absence. my mind knew instantly that it was still there hiding in disguise, and in the time it took me to realize it was too late, jagged tentacles shot out of the darkness, changing from the shimmering green blur of the water around it as it gripped me. I writhed on my back and struggled in a desperate effort. I lay free, but it was no use, as more and more tentacles poured out around me, digging their hooks into my suit and skin. Described as a pit of sticks and jaws full of broken teeth, it was the mouth of hell, an unstoppable mill working at full steam and instinct, just desperate to smash the skewer and crush me before I could eat it, as I assumed it would. Eddie devours ye. I remembered that I was completely defenseless, and in a furious move I swung my welder, turning it white and blue, puncturing and burning one of the tentacles I was holding, and it instantly flew away from me like a torpedo, bouncing and spinning darkly. The walls around me dissolved again as I moved, becoming invisible to my eyes, but I knew it was still there, so without a moment's hesitation I began swimming toward the surface, certain that that amorphous, nightmarish thing was behind every blow I made. I got out, pulled the harness and let the oxygen tank sink beneath me, trying to take as much weight off me as possible, and the moment I let go, I saw this huge, flexible black nest with tooth-covered appendages grab the tank and drag it away. With a final rush of adrenaline, it surfaced and onto the boat, and let me tell you, that didn't make me safe on that little raft, knowing that below me was a massive, more than capable octopus. I pulled the boat into his sinking underworld, and even after speeding the boat to shore, I couldn't help but picture the thing screaming on the shore to get me out. Believe me, Eddie had just become another tragic event, with the oxygen tank failing in the lake that killed him, a conclusion the authorities came to without an autopsy or body injury, and I suffered no more. Before the first responder at the power plant told me I was having a side effect from nitrogen narcosis, I stopped fishing in my spare time, but I continued to warn people to report what I saw in the lake, just as I had been skeptical of the man. By eating up the leech tails, others were now skeptical of my fictional story about the one-size-fits-all octopus living in the cooling tunnels of the power plant. The freshwater octopus that is impossible to reach the size you described, and I have to tell them, as my grandfather told me, Lake Arrow has bad water and they have to dive to the surface with the same doubt I had. They will face the truth. There is something in this lake. I don't know how or why or what exactly, but it is there and it is hungry.
And so, the story ends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all the stories. Like, share and rate the story in a comment. Thank you for watching.